morning, and welcome to today's opening keynote, Indigenomics, Opportunities in the Indigenous Economy. South Island Prosperity Partnership and this event are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen, being Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And so before we start today's events, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our traditional hosts and offer gratitude for hosting our event today in their territories, as well as for their ongoing contribution to this important dialogue about prosperity in the South Island. My name is Linda Hartford. I am a member of CIP and the National Director of CIBC Trust Indigenous Markets. I am also blessed to live and work here in the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people in Victoria, BC. CIBC Indigenous Markets is a proud partner of CIP and the tremendous work being done here in the South Island by CIP to support our local economy, invest in economic development, and true prosperity for all of our communities. CIP's mission is to facilitate and promote the development of a strong, diversified economy on southern Vancouver Island, fostering collaboration and creating a more vibrant place to work. One of the key tenets of this mission is to engage with our local First Nations in self-directed economic initiatives. I can think of no better speaker to speak to the opportunities and the rising of the Indigenous economy than Vancouver Island's own Carol-Ann Hilton. Carol-Ann, of course, is the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute and the Global Center of Indigenomics. Carol-Ann is from Hesquiaht Nation and is a national Indigenous business leader whose work focuses on the rebuilding and strengthening of Indigenous economies. Carol-Ann now lives, works, and plays in the Lekwungen territories as well, and I know has expressed her love for the South Island and the Salish Sea. Carol-Ann is a renowned author, speaker, and educator with numerous awards and accolades. A true thought leader in BC, in Canada, and globally on the Indigenous economy and the power it has to create true economic freedom for Indigenous nations and contribute to the GDP and prosperity of communities in a powerful way. Carol-Ann is, of course, very modest, and she told me to keep it short. So I won't go through her bio and her numerous awards. I encourage you to have a look at her bio, which is posted for this event, and also encourage you to have a look at our upcoming conference for 2020, Designing Our Economies, Indigenomics by Design Virtual Forum, which is coming up on Monday, November 30th. Please welcome the exceptional Carol-Ann Hilton.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and spend time with you today. I've watched the development of the agenda and with greatest excitement, seeing the level of collaboration come together, both for this forum and building our response to now. Uklasish Carol-Ann Hilton, Hesquiaht Supsish Uklas Wakatush Koetza Umti. I am Nuchana from the Hesquiaht Nation. My Nuchana name is Wakatush, which means big sister. I'm super happy to join you. I am honored to work and live in Lekwungen territories. It's good to join you virtually, and I bring much respect to the original stories, the original ceremonies, the original songs, the language of here. These are all constructs of and that shape and form Indigenous reality of which we live and work within here in Victoria region. Again, thank you for the invitation to come spend time with you. I've participated both within the task force. I've come from a number of years on the Canadian Economic Growth Council and most recently with the BC Emerging Economy Task Force, and really beginning to look at those larger trends. And what I'm seeing is that the trends of both globalization, the trends of localization are really in front of us and calling on our leadership, calling on our ability to center our leadership in what is our economic response to right now. I like this concept of the associative words that we identify with right now. Probably the most strongest one is you're on mute. But other than that, I think that I really am seeing that concept and relationships being built around the experience of an unprecedented now. And when we look at this concept of unprecedented, it leaves us without the same anchors of the experience of reality of what used to be normal. This concept of Build Back Better is an essential construct of collaboration, of design, and of leadership. I often refer to the work of the Rising Economy Task Force in the work that I do nationally is, are there examples of the ways that we can collaborate? And I really raise my hands to the Rising Economy Task Force and the leadership in bringing that together here through this organization, because being able to facilitate that cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary, multicultural perspectives of what is our response to now. So some of you may have heard of the concept of Indigenomics, and some of you that concept may be new. Indigenomics originated on social media as a hashtag. And essentially what it has been shaped and formed as to be defined as Indigenomic, as economics from an Indigenous perspective. So understanding the truths with which we build from is a formative concept of Indigenomics. So the formative truth essentially is that Canada, British Columbia, and Victoria, and its surrounding regions was systemically built on Indigenous economic exclusion. If we can build from that simple truth, we can also build a new future that looks at inclusion and systemic Indigenous economic design. I like to refer to this historical baggage from which we operate. Canada, British Columbia, and the Victoria region were all deeply shaped within this concept of the Indian problem. As we looked at the original acts that shaped the Indigenous relationship, the formation of Indian reserves was a structure of economic exclusion. So Indigenous peoples have been responding to now since the time of contact, since the time of the Indian Act, and experiencing the structures of economic regression. And while what we are experiencing collectively now is the quickening of economic regression and the experience of what that looks like within this region. I refer to this concept of the Indian problem that has shaped policy, that has shaped budgets, and that has shaped ongoing systemic Indigenous economic exclusion over time. I refer to this concept of the socioeconomic gap. So many of you will understand or see through the lens of statistics of how our Indigenous populations have been defined. Those statistics often refer to, it could be early death rates, high suicide rates, high number of people in jail, high number of children in care, lower education levels, whatever those are essentially an expression of a larger symptom. So we look to the concept of marginalization, we look to the experience of marginalization. And what I posit is that if we're seeing high percentage of this negative statistics in Indigenous reality, what it is really establishing is a call for a higher percentage of Indigenous worldview, Indigenous leadership, and Indigenous inclusion. The socioeconomic gap cannot be only looked at as a concept of Indigenous peoples are falling behind. No, we need to look at the ability to respond to systemic Indigenous economic exclusion over time. So now, how do we look at the structures of Indigenous economic inclusion through a COVID lens? That is the opportunity that presents itself right now. I define specifically economic reconciliation as the space between the lived realities of Indigenous peoples, the need to build understanding of the importance of the Indigenous relationship, and the space to create new actions today. So if we look at it in economic reconciliation, this experience of the socioeconomic gap of high poverty levels or high unemployment rates, that is a reflection of the lived reality of Indigenous peoples. Any actions today and a pathway going forward has to support the shift towards a positive lived realities of Indigenous peoples. So that system can be established through the structures of inclusion and looking at the pathways of supporting employment, supporting economic inclusion, economic design, and the leadership for the increase of Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs today. It is important to understand that when we center our current understanding of the Indigenous relationship, it is often fragmented or missing pieces of information. So as we collectively design recommendations that support a COVID Indigenous economic response, it is good to go and reflect on your understanding or areas that need more clarification to build why the Indigenous economic relationship is important and of significance today. I referred to this concept of Indigenomics as constructive generative economic design, that it supports the increase of Indigenous business activity, that it supports the evolution and growth of Indigenous entrepreneurs. I refer to this concept of an Indigenomics toolbox to be able to look at key components of building understanding of the foundation of the Indigenous relationship over time. I encourage you to begin to build your understanding around concepts such as the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What are the tenets of that declaration? To really understand that the need for an Indigenous rights declaration, I am often asked the question, well, aren't Indigenous rights the same as human rights? Shouldn't they be the same as everybody else's rights? Well, what is important to understand is that the reason or requirement for Indigenous rights is the absence of how those rights have been expressed across time. What is important to me to understand within the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is that there's central components within that. The right to an economy, the right to self-determination, the right to set up our own institutions, and the right to continue as peoples. When we look at all of those within the context of economy building, I also posit that Indigenous peoples are the only ones in this country who have had to fight for the right to an economy. If we look at examples right now, we look on the other side of the country with the Mi'kmaq people who are actively every single day creating space for themselves at the economic table of this country. So if we look at that concept of creating space at the economic table, building on a truth of systemic Indigenous economic exclusion, it is essential that we build in our response, we also build our understanding. So in this toolbox, we look at the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I would encourage you to look at the 2008 Indigenous apology to the Indigenous population. What did the apology say? Why was that important? That is a central moment of building and responding to the Indigenous relationship within this country. I encourage you to understand and build your understanding around what is free, prior, and informed consent. How was it shaped through the courts, and why is that essential in the economic reality of this country today? I encourage you to look at leading court cases such as the Tsilhqot'in, or often referred to as the Williams case. In building your understanding, we are told truths of which have been dismantled through the Indigenous legal relationship and the evolvement of that over time. Previously, we believed that there was crown title and fee simple. We looked to the leadership of the Williams case, which inserted a third level of Indigenous title. The implications of that from an economic perspective are significant, and that is the new reality or the unprecedented economic shift that has been facilitated and now requires an economic response. I encourage you to build your understanding of what is the doctrine of discovery. Why is it important? How has that been a central tenet of fee simple land within this country? How has that facilitated further economic isolation and regression of Indigenous peoples and nations? I encourage you to understand the Royal Proclamation. What is it? Why is it important? I encourage you to bring into your conversations the leadership around the significance of the calls of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, which demonstrated thousands and thousands and thousands of Indigenous residential school survivors of their experience of racism and their experience of the return to Canadian society and that relationship with Indigenous peoples. I encourage you to understand the concept of unceded. What is it? Why does it matter? To look at the federal government's principles respecting Indigenous relationship. What are those principles? Why are they important? And how can they be facilitated within our local economic development relationships? What is the Indian Act? How does it affect Indigenous nationhood? What are Indian reserves? These are not always clear demonstrations that we emerge from our collective education systems with. To be able to understand the economic landscape of the Indigenous relationship today, what is important is to understand both the data and our ability to frame growth and why Indigenous economic growth is essential nationally, regionally, and locally. I refer back to the early days of the formation of Victoria itself, to those old pictures that demonstrate high trade and market activity of our people coming from all over the island and selling baskets. The inner harbor demonstrating Indigenous business activity, where now I think that the ability to see Indigenous entrepreneurship, look at the landscape of this place and really identify where are we seeing Indigenous economic activity? Where are those places to strengthen our economic relationships? I look to the, in the Chemainus region, the Ladysmith area, a number of years ago, I refer to this story where the Chemainus Nation in Ladysmith held a business open house. What was important to me in witnessing that open house was that it was an invitation for local partners to come and do business. So whether it was engineers or financiers or the logging industry, the whole spectrum of engagement into that local Indigenous economy, where the nation was essentially inviting partners to come and participate in the future of the nation's economy. What I saw there was significant because the mayor came to the local nation and the chief opened the open house with initial remarks and then invited the mayor up at the time. And what I saw there, the mayor stepped onto the stage, he grabbed the mic and he said, since the establishment of the town of Ladysmith, there is nobody that has crossed the line onto the reserve. And what he said was, it's time to do business. And that's all he said. He walked off. And I think that that was a clear demonstration of the leadership that it's time to cross the fabricated lines of that we believe exist. It's time to reach across to be able to introduce yourselves, to establish the opportunities, to see the opportunities of doing business with Indigenous nations. I wrote a book called Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. So what is important in the concept of taking a seat at the economic table is to build from the truth of Indigenous economic exclusion, the experience of that, and the impact of that over time. The concept of taking a seat at the economic table is also relevant now. We need to see Indigenous peoples at boardrooms. We need to see Indigenous spaces at sectoral tables, whether that's in tourism or forestry or aquaculture, looking at these tables as examples, as a construct of making space at. While Indigenous peoples were systemically disinvited to taking a seat at the economic table, that is the task and what is looking at us directly now. How are we collectively making room at the economic table? Because essentially to build back better now means to build from that truth, means to be able to explore our future together. This is essentially the opportunity to be able to look at inclusive Indigenous economic design. If we look to the larger landscape of the Indigenous economy, what I am seeing is that there's a higher number of Indigenous businesses, of whether that's through the nations-based economic development corporations, their partnership businesses, or Indigenous entrepreneurs that are independent. The level of capital that is required, what we are seeing is that the growth of the Indigenous economy is happening in spite of the Indian Act, in spite of the low levels of capital, despite a program and service approach to the Indigenous economy. What is important to me in being able to come and speak with you today is really this demonstration of a narrative that Indigenous economic growth is not only important for Indigenous communities, but it is important to our local economies overall. To be able to understand that connection, that Indigenous economic development isn't just about money and growth. It's essentially about, again, we look to those concepts of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of having that right to an economy and expressing that, about continuing our ways of being. So what we see oftentimes within the economic development process is that there's conflicting objectives, so that a nation has to be able to support its land base, its resources, and make decisions based on long-term generational thinking. So with the requirement of understanding that Indigenous business is often connected directly back to family and back to community that supports community and personal well-being. That well-being is reflected in our ability to understand that it's connected to our language, to our culture, to our elders, to our children. So that's really where we're seeing the distinction of Indigenous business, its objectives, and a mainstream business. So when we realize that Indigenous economic development process is directly connected to a community's well-being, that's essential of what we're wanting to see, is that our future collectively is directly connected to Indigenous well-being and connected to Indigenous economic design and inclusion. This concept of exploring our future together, the opportunity that is in front of us, this really is about a time of being able to tell a new story. If I look to this whole concept in a global experience of COVID overall, I think back to this story that originates within my Onu Channel tradition. So in my Onu Channel tradition, we have supernatural beings. This includes a thunderbird, that includes the double-headed sea serpent. In our stories, the thunderbird sends down lightning and feeds on whales, and it's a being of transformation. It's a supernatural representation of an expanded worldview that allows insight into a world that we as humans humbly know very little about because it exists on the spiritual domain. So this concept of a double-headed sea serpent is where this story emerges. So the story is essentially told that if a double-headed sea serpent is the most gruesome thing that you could ever come across. And if you are to come across one, that essentially it is so gruesome that you will want to run in fear, that its wreathing heads, that when you come upon it, you have a choice, so that you can look at its gruesomeness and you can make a choice in that moment and you can run away in fear. But if you do, you will run away in fear forever. The other side of that story is essentially that if you choose to stay, to stand in your own truth, to look directly at the double-headed sea serpent, that its double head will come to see itself and it will collapse into itself. I believe very firmly that that is a metaphor of our time, of a global economic crisis that is born from its own worldview. Our choice to stand in the truth of this time is essentially built from our ability to stand in our truth, to stand in what we see, and to form and shape our leadership in this moment. We essentially have that choice. We see global systems collapsing. We see financial systems weighing the burden of what our collective response is to right now in this COVID environment. Our response must be inclusive. Our response must be driven by well-being. Our response must be driven by our ability to look at the design of economic reconciliation today in our relationship. This is the new story that must be told. What did we do today to make room at the economic table? If we sit at boardrooms where everybody looks like us, that is a clear indication of the requirement for inclusion and to expand the worldview that is presented in front of us. I encourage you to take a moment and look at the built environment that you are in right now. That built environment most likely will have been built from one worldview. That is the opportunity right now, is to expand the built environment that we are seeing as our collective economic response to now. When we are able to understand the opportunities as they are reflected to us in the arena of what collaboration can look like right now, I refer to some of the recommendations that have emerged from within the rising economy context. As a past board member of the Community Microlending Organization, I can't speak enough to the life-changing dynamic of the microlending framework and its ability to shift the lives of entrepreneurs. Looking at the concept of building a microlending framework to support the development of Indigenous entrepreneurs locally, I see as an essential component to what success of the Indigenous economic response can look like here in this region. Our people want to establish micro businesses, essentially to be able to facilitate an increase of these entrepreneurs. That is an essential economic response to now in this region. I look to that concept of social procurement, where we see examples of the evolving framework of inclusion and the social nature and dynamic of procurement overall. To look at that as an economic response to now is an essential component and a pathway to support Indigenous economic inclusion today. I recently did a piece of work through the Central Region District, where what I saw was that through all the municipal leadership in the councils, that there was silos of planning, specifically in terms of economic development, that had the invisibility of Indigenous communities widely apparent within the process. We no longer can exist establishing processes of economic development planning in silos. We need to bring the Indigenous experience of growing regional Indigenous economies to the municipalities and no longer exist within silos. That is an essential economic response to be able to build back better today in a COVID environment. I like the concept of building an Indigenous business directory, bringing the visibility of Indigenous entrepreneurs into one place and driving the ability to support both investability and accessibility to Indigenous businesses. These concepts are really opportunities, and this is really a place to be able to demonstrate what is our leadership and what is our response to now. This concept of build back better, this concept that we are in an unprecedented time, is essentially really the opportunity that is reflecting back to us. To understand this concept of Indigenomics, what I have positioned regionally and asked the question is really, what do we know about our local Indigenous economies? Do we know how many Indigenous economic development corporations there are? Do we really know how many Indigenous entrepreneurs there are? Do we know a regional context of investment or a framework for investment into Indigenous businesses? Are we facilitating conversations around engaging Indigenous businesses within the region? I look to the federal budget of this past year, which outlined $1 billion of Indigenous procurement from federal departments. A demonstration of this leadership is essentially understanding what is the potential of $1 billion of Indigenous economic activity deployed through our businesses. I have pressed very hard nationally to begin to establish what are the foundational elements of design of Indigenous economic growth. My work at the Indigenomics Institute is to facilitate into Canadian consciousness the potential of a $100 billion national annual Indigenous economy. The concept of $100 billion is essentially future pacing an economic reality of Canada that supports Indigenous economic inclusion and the design for the investment into the uptake of Indigenous businesses. The concept of $100 billion is future pacing our conscious reality that we can establish decision-making at the current level, or we can understand that we need new decisions, new actions, and new leadership within the evolvement of a $100 billion national Indigenous economy. To future pace our economic reality means that we need the tools, the investment, the institutions to facilitate our economic relationships with Indigenous communities and businesses. I look to my niece, Brianne, who is, I believe, 9 years old, and over the past year, established her own business doing beading and necklaces and selling down at the Causeway. As a 9-year-old Indigenous entrepreneur from Hesquiaht, what struck me was her personal sense of seeing her ability as an Indigenous entrepreneur. An example of this is a young leader who understands that essentially that spirit inside of her to be able to build her business, to market it, to understand sales, and to understand her ability to get product to market is remarkable. My niece Brianne is a demonstration of the potential and the capacity of the evolving army of Indigenous entrepreneurs that we're seeing. I bring your attention to a new demonstration of a commerce platform, which is Shop First Nations, which is a rudimentary beginning to bring together Indigenous entrepreneurs and their visibility within the region. That part of the COVID response was bringing those entrepreneurs that had product to potential buyers, and to be able to understand the use of commerce, the use of technology, and bringing the visibility of the number or the volume of Indigenous entrepreneurs into a structure. That is an example that I think demonstrates the leadership to facilitate the space for Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses and products to increase that visibility, accessibility, and what is important to me is also to facilitate investability into Indigenous business. If we look at the requirement of the risk that is established with the Indian Reserve System, the development of business, and how that directly affects the ability to facilitate capital investment into businesses, that is something I think as well that is Indigenomics by design. The key elements of which new structures, new relationships, and pathways for investability into Indigenous businesses must be addressed. I really would encourage this region to continue to engage with Indigenous business leadership to really hear what the experience has been. So understanding that some of the economic COVID response dollars has been highly socially based to support our communities from a health and well-being perspective. When we look at the economic side of this, the support to Indigenous businesses become essential. What is also, in closing, I want to bring your attention to this idea of the right to an economy and the ability to express that in a region. So really looking at where are the points of inclusion. So my understanding is the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority has very much built up a platform for economic inclusion of Indigenous businesses and nations in recent years, where we look to where is the leadership of the Chamber of Commerce of bringing visibility to Indigenous businesses as well. What we're seeing is a trend across the country of an increase of Indigenous Chamber of Commerces and that are aligned to the greater or larger mainstream Chamber of Commerces. These are points of economic inclusion where we see, opportunities in cities of procurement with an Indigenous focus, where we're seeing opportunities to develop inclusion at the sectoral tables where we're wanting to see and hear and include Indigenous peoples. So these are really some examples that I wanted to be able to demonstrate of what I'm seeing within the Indigenous economic landscape, that we need to get over the socioeconomic gap and start seeing and facilitating Indigenous economic strength. This concept of Indigenous economic inclusion must support the lived realities of our Indigenous communities. To be able to have a system of exclusion, this is the time to be inviting the conversation towards collaboration, towards Indigenous economic design, and to be able to center our leadership on the importance of the Indigenous relationship here in Canada, in BC, and within the region. I think that this associative perspective of building our response to now, to build back better, we must be able to build on the truths of the experience of Indigenous economic exclusion. When we can address that and build pathways for inclusion, to center our leadership in Indigenous economic growth supports regional economies, that the intrinsically linked connection to both is now the new story that must be told. A region that is in a strategic advantage understands that having Indigenous peoples at the economic table is fundamental to the success of now and to our future. The concept of Indigenomics itself is an invitation to find that leadership, to find new actions, and to support the building of understanding of inclusion, and to build the understanding that this is the time to be creating new actions. So I leave you with this question: who wants to play Indigenomics? The time is now, and let's have the courage to do this together. Thank you so much for the time to come and spend with you today. I wish you well for the remainder of your forum. And my understanding is that we will move to having some questions and answers, and I look forward to spending that time with you. And again, thank you for inviting me and having my voice as an integral part to what Building Back Better means today. Thank you.
Hi, Jesse, I'm Carol Ann. This is the part where you would hear thunderous applause if we weren't all on Zoom. And that was really meaningful. You have a gift for articulating where we are now, how we got here, and what we can do about it that I really admire. And I'm really aligned with a lot of things that you have to say. We have some questions here, some great questions, and we may not be able to get through them all, but let's give it a try. So the first question is from Sita. What is the advantage of adopting a strategy to build back better for 7 generations?
That is a great question. That concept of 7-generation thinking, my understanding is framed in Iroquois philosophy that says our ability to make a decision today has to take into account the effects or impacts of that decision across 7 generations. So if we look at some of the regional recommendations that were put forward collaboratively and collectively around what is our response to now, and put a 7-generation lens on that, where we'll see positive construct is in supporting employment, supporting this concept of economic growth, but also an idea that the decisions we make have to come from that watershed perspective of maintaining our resources, looking after the region from the ecological perspective. The strategic advantage of generational decision making, that is also an opportunity to look at the recommendations of what our response to now is and look at what those impacts are in 7 generations. That really is thinking from an Indigenous worldview. Thank you for the question.
What are some strategies that might ensure that efforts at inclusion and collaboration with Indigenous peoples are or do not appear to come across as tokenism?
I like to put, sorry, I was just writing a note there. I like to put the visual concept of a spectrum. So on the far left side, we have people, companies, governments that are unengaged, uninformed, or uneducated. And that could be a context of just not accessing or not having visibility of Indigenous businesses or the economy. Then we have people in the middle that are somewhat engaged, have somewhat understanding, are asking questions of how can we do this better. And then on the far right, we see highly engaged, educated, and placing their leadership to designing economic relationships that are collaborative. So locating ourselves within that spectrum is important. There are people that are unengaged, uninterested. There are businesses that are unengaged, uninterested. This idea of a, what do they call it? Indigenous works, a number of years ago, did a series of national surveys of CEOs of small, medium enterprises, as well as larger corporations. And what the results of that study demonstrated that 85% of Canadian businesses are unengaged in any way, shape, or form. So instead of seeing that primarily as a problem, I think we can also see that as an opportunity. So understanding where you are in that spectrum, we have a choice in it. We can look at that and have the ability to remain unengaged, uninterested, and uninformed, or we can explore in our leadership those concepts of the toolbox that I outlined for you. Start building your understanding, start building the history of economic exclusion, start building an understanding of this new narrative of the strategic advantage of working with Indigenous businesses and nations. Again, I commend the leadership of the Rising Economy Task Force and the South Island Prosperity, because right from the very beginning, Indigenous inclusion has been an essential component, and to hear the voices of what the experience of the COVID response to now has been. Thank you.
Here's a question from Tina. What gaps do Indigenous women and Indigenous youth face within entrepreneurship?
For sure. I have this at my conference coming up on the 30th, the virtual forum. The last panel of the day is an Indigenous Entrepreneurship panel led by my good friend, Tiara Fraser. And it's called Dream It, Design It, Do It. And what it essentially doing is bringing the conversation of Indigenous entrepreneurs together around what has their experience been of becoming an Indigenous entrepreneur. I often say one of the most powerful sentences that we can say today is, I am an Indigenous entrepreneur, because it takes grit, it takes courage, it takes nerves, and it takes really a true ability to stand in the truth of courage and a response to there's another reality, there's another alternative option to unemployment and poverty. I think that this concept of dream it, design it, and do it that Tiara and the panel will be working with is how much courage it takes to be an entrepreneur, to realize the barriers to capital, the systemic barriers to capital. I often say that as I see Indigenous entrepreneurs becoming educated in the processes of businesses, that we can train with the hard skills. You know, what is a business plan, a marketing plan, accounting or bookkeeping, all of those kind of tangible business skills. But what is also important in that is the soft skills, the human skills of courage management. It takes a lot of courage for anyone to be an entrepreneur, to be an Indigenous entrepreneur, and to face additional barriers and systemic systems of exclusion, I think is an admirable, and what we're seeing is this army of entrepreneurs happening across the country. I think CCAB identified a number of years ago, it's a dated number now, there was over 65,000 Indigenous entrepreneurs. And I think that number has to be well over 100,000 now. And we realized that establishing an environment of support for and mentorship for Indigenous businesses is a smart approach to facilitating both that courage and inclusion of Indigenous businesses within this region. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question from Vern. In Alberta, there are 2 regional rail projects that have the support of the Indigenous nations between Calgary and Banff, as well as Calgary to Edmonton. How can we build a strong relationship to design a sustainable bridge benefiting everyone? What successes have you seen within BC that we can learn from during the development of the respective projects' feasibility studies?
For sure, that's a great question. I draw your attention to the Sliammon region, and there's a case study that outlined the development of the relationship between the chief and between the mayor, and how the history of the region had been very siloed relationships, that the reserve was over here, the town was over here, and there was very little interaction. An impending incident brought the chief to the mayor's office and essentially could have been embedded within conflict, but instead, when engagement, listening, and being present were shaped the future of that relationship, what was impacted was new business opportunities, new ways of relating and engaging to the nation. I think we need to be able to get over fear of conflict and actually listen. What has been that experience? Because 150 plus years of systemic exclusion, you have something to say about that. And I think when it's being listened to and there's solutions for inclusion, that's really the place that we'll begin to see moving that relationship forward in the situation that you're discussing. Make time to hear what that experience has been, make time to collaborate on ways of working together instead of imposing this is what is going to happen or from a project perspective. So that concept of making room or having a seat at the economic table, that's really a symbol of ways of engaging, listening, and designing new actions. Thank you.
This is a question from Emily. One of the Indigenous Economy Committee's recommendations was about establishing an independent Indigenous Economic Development Office in the South Island. How can this office be used as a springboard for inclusive economic design and become a leading case study for Canada?
Absolutely. I think that is a fantastic recommendation. To look at the structure of an Indigenous Economic Office, what I see is that we're hiding behind a data gap. We really don't know the number of Indigenous businesses. We don't know the investment requirements to Indigenous growth here. How well do we know either the local economic development corporations, one of which you run, Christine? What are the visibility of those corporations in the regional economic development structure? That points of collaboration and the points of the seat at the economic table, I referred to that concept of regional economic planning happening in silos. We need to have those plans connected to Songhee's plans. We need those plans connected to Esquimalt plans. That is a pivotal point of success that I see can be built from what this response to now is in this current environment, that we no longer do regional economic planning in silos and we bring Indigenous peoples to the table and make room. Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree. The final question that we have is, can a world economic view of ecosystems be the unifier we seek?
Can a world economic view of which system?
Of ecosystems be the unifier we seek?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think that I have a line of thought within this concept of Indigenomics that the devaluing of Indigenous worldview, the overrepresentation of European worldview, the balance of those is essential to how we respond at a global level. So that ecosystem and an inherent sense of Indigenous responsibility to future generations, I think, isn't really about inclusion and expansion of worldview. Thank you.
We are at 9:55 and there are 4 more questions. I do want to make sure that we say thank you to CIBC for your generous sponsorship of this session, and to the Royal Bank of Canada and Western Diversification Canada for your support of Rising Economy Week. So I'd like to ask you, one of the other questions that we have comes from Dallas. I wonder if you can speak to the concept of urban reserves as a method of First Nations obtaining higher value land that they can derive better revenues or equity from. Often reserves are far removed from the areas like within urban cores where land can derive real value and equity over time. Are these urban reserve transfers appropriate and feasible?
Thank you. So I have not seen development of urban reserves within BC as much. Excuse me. I've seen that more on the plains, and I think that was contextual to the population and proximity to the cities. I don't disagree with the concept of urban reserves. I think where we could see that be successful is within the housing arena and shaping community from that perspective.
Yes, like where are village sites within the territory? I know of one, and that is the Muskeg Lake Cree in Saskatoon. They have an urban reserve there that they use entirely for commercial purposes. And it's sort of a gateway for them into the economy of Saskatoon. So thank you very much, Carol Ann, and thank you everyone who attended to our session today. It was fantastic. I learned a lot. And Carol Ann, I hope you will help us build the Regional Economic Development Office that we need here on the South Island.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.